Lesson 14. Astral-Body Traveling by Walker Atkinson. There is much confusion existing in the minds of the average students of occultism concerning the distinction between astral visioning by means of the astral senses and clairvoyance, and the visioning of the astral senses during the travels of the astral body away from the physical body. There is such a close connection between the two several phases of occult phenomena that it is easy to mistake one for the other. In fact, there is often such a blending of the two that it is quite difficult to distinguish between them. However, in this lesson I shall endeavor to bring out the characteristics of astral body visioning, that the student may learn to distinguish them from those of the ordinary clairvoyant astral visioning, and recognize them when he experiences them. The main points of distinction are these. When visioning clairvoyantly by means of the astral senses, as described in the preceding chapters of this book, the clairvoyant usually perceives the scene, person, or event as a picture on a flat surface. It is true that there is generally a perfect perspective, similar to that of a good stereoscopic view, or that of a high-grade moving picture photograph. The figures stand out and do not appear flat, as in the case of an ordinary photograph. But still, at the best, it is like looking at a moving picture, inasmuch as the whole scene is all in front of you. Visioning in the astral body, on the contrary, gives you an all-around view of the scene. That is to say, in such case you see the thing just as you would were you there in your physical body. You see in front of you, on the sides of you, out of the corner of your eye. If you turn your head, you may see in any direction, and you may turn around and see what is happening behind you. In the first case, you are merely gazing at an astral picture in front of you, while in the second place you are actually there in person. There are some limitations to this seeing all around when in the astral body, however, which I should note in passing. For instance, if when in the astral body you examine the Akashic records of the past, or else peer into the scenes of the future, you will see these things merely as a picture, and will not be conscious of being present personally in the scene. An apparent exception is to be noted here also, viz. If your past-time visioning includes the perception of yourself in a former incarnation, you may be conscious of living and acting in your former personality. Again, if you are psychometrizing from fossil remains, or anything concerned with the living creature of the past, you may take on the mental or emotional conditions of that creature and seem to sense things from the inside, rather than from the outside. This, of course, is also a characteristic of the ordinary clairvoyant vision of the past. But when, in the astral body, you perceive a present-time scene in space, you are, to all intents and purposes, an actual participant. You are actually present at the place and time. The sense of being actually present in the body is the leading characteristic of the astral body visioning and distinguishes it from the picture-seeing sensing of ordinary clairvoyance. This is stating the matter is as plain and simple form as is possible, ignoring many technical details and particulars. You, being a student of occultism, of course know that the astral body is a fine counterpart of the physical body, composed of a far more subtle form of substance than is the latter, that under certain conditions you may travel in your astral body, detached from your physical body, except being connected with it with a slender astral cord, bearing a close resemblance to the umbilical cord which connects the newborn babe with the placenta in the womb of its mother, and explore the realms of the astral plane. This projection of the astral body, as a rule, occurs only when the physical body is stilled in sleep or in trance condition. In fact, the astral body frequently is projected by us during the course of our ordinary sleep, but we fail to remember what we have seen in our astral journeys, except occasionally dim flashes of partial recollection upon awakening. In some cases, however, our astral visioning is so distinct and vivid that we awaken with a sense of having had a peculiar experience, and as having actually been out of the physical body at the time. In some cases, the person traveling in the astral is able to actually take part in the distant scene, and may, under certain circumstances, actually materialize himself so as to be seen by persons in their physical bodies. I am speaking now, of course, of the untrained person. The trained and developed occultist, of course, is able to do these things deliberately and consciously, instead of unconsciously and without intention as in the case of the ordinary person. I shall quote here from another writer on the subject, whose point of view, in connection with my own, may serve to bring about a clear understanding in the mind of the student. It is always well to view any subject from as many angles as possible. This writer says, "We enter here upon an entirely new variety of clairvoyance, in which the consciousness of the seer no longer remains in or closely connected with his physical body, but is definitely transferred to the scene which he is examining. Though it has no doubt greater dangers for the untrained seer than either of the other methods, it is yet quite the most satisfactory form of clairvoyance open to him. In this case, the man's body is either asleep or in a trance, and its organs are consequently not available for use while the vision is going on, so that all description of what is seen and all questioning as to further particulars must be postponed until the wanderer returns to this plane. On the other hand, the sight is much fuller and more perfect. The man hears as well as sees everything which passes before him, and can move about freely at will within the very wide limits of the astral plane. He has also the immense advantage of being able to take part, as it were, in the scenes which come before his eyes of conversing at will with various entities on the astral plane, and from whom so much information that is curious and interesting may be obtained. If in addition he can learn how to materialize himself, a matter of no great difficulty for him when once the knack is acquired, he will be able to take part in physical events or conversations at a distance, and to show himself to an absent friend at will. Again, he will have the additional power of being able to hunt about for what he wants. By means of the other varieties of clairvoyance, for all practical purposes he may find a person or place only when he is already acquainted with it, or when he is put in rapport with it by touching something physically connected with it, as in psychometry. By the use of the astral body, however, a man can move about quite freely and rapidly in any direction, and can, for example, find without difficulty any place pointed out upon a map, without either any previous knowledge of the spot or any object to establish a connection with it. He can also readily rise high into the air so as to gain a bird's-eye view of the country which he is examining, so as to observe its extent, the contour of its coastline, or its general character. Indeed, in every way his power and freedom are far greater when he uses this method than they are in any of the lesser forms of clairvoyance. In many well-authenticated cases, we may see that the soul of a dying person, one whose physical end is approaching, visits friends and relatives in the astral body, and in many cases materializes and even speaks to them. In such cases, the dying person accomplishes the feat of astral manifestation without any special occult knowledge. The weakened links between the physical and the higher phases of the soul render the temporary passing out comparatively easy, and the strong desire of the dying person furnishes the motive power necessary. Such visits, however, are often found to be merely the strongly charged thought of the dying person, along the lines of telepathy, as I have previously explained to you. But in many cases there can be no doubt that the phenomenon is a clear case of astral visitation and materialization. The records of the Society for Psychical Research contain many instances of this kind, and similar instances are to be found in other records of psychical research. I shall quote a few of these cases for you, that you may get a clear idea of the characteristics thereof. Andrew Lang, an eminent student and investigator along the lines of the psychic and occult, gives us the following case, of which he says, "Not many stories have such good evidence in their favor." The story is related by Mr. Lang in one of his books, is as follows. Mary, the wife of John Goff of Rochester, being afflicted with a long illness, removed to her father's house at West Mailing, about 9 miles from her own. The day before her death, she grew very impatiently desirous to see her 2 children, whom she had left at home to the care of a nurse. She was too ill to be moved, and between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning she fell into a trance. One widow, Turner, who watched with her that night, says that her eyes were open and fixed, and her jaw fallen. Mrs. Turner put her hand to her mouth, but could perceive no breath. She thought her to be in a fit, and doubted whether she were dead or alive. The next morning the dying woman told her mother that she had been at home with her children, saying, "I was with them last night when I was asleep." The nurse at Rochester, widow Alexander by name, affirms that a little before 2 o'clock that morning she saw the likeness of the said Mary Goff come out of the next chamber, where the elder child lay in a bed by itself, the door being left open, and stood by her bedside for about a quarter of an hour. The younger child was there lying by her. Her eyes moved and her mouth went, but she said nothing. The nurse, moreover, says that she was perfectly awake. It was then daylight, being one of the longest days of the year. She sat up in bed and looked steadfastly on the apparition. In that time she heard the bridge clock strike 2, and a while after said, In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, what art thou? Thereupon the apparition removed and went away. She slipped out of her clothes and followed, but what became on't she cannot tell. In the case just mentioned, Mr. Lang states that the nurse was so frightened that she was afraid to return to bed. As soon as the neighbors were up and about, she told them of what she had seen, but they told her that she had been dreaming. It was only when, later on, news came of what had happened at the other end of the line, the bedside of the dying woman, that they realized just what had happened. In a work by Reverend F.G. Lee, there are several other cases of this kind quoted, all of which are stated by Mr. Lee to be thoroughly well authenticated. In one of the cases, a mother, when dying in Egypt, appears to her children in Torquay, and is clearly seen in broad daylight by all 5 children and also by the nursemaid. In another, a Quaker lady dying at Cockermouth is clearly seen and recognized in daylight by her 3 children at Seattle, the remainder of the story being almost identical with that of the Goff case just quoted. In the records of the Society for Psychical Research, the following case appears, the person reporting it being said to be of good character and reputation for truthfulness and reliability. The story is as follows. One morning in December 1836, A. had the following dream, or he would prefer to call it revelation. He found himself suddenly at the gate of Major N.M.'s Avenue, many miles from his home. Close to him was a group of persons, one of whom was a woman with a basket on her arm. The rest were men, for of whom were tenants of his own, while the others were unknown to him. Some of the strangers seemed to be assaulting H.W., one of his tenants, and he interfered. Says, I struck violently at the man on my left, and then with greater violence at the man's face on my right. Finding, to my surprise, that I had not knocked down either, I struck again and again with all the violence of a man frenzied at the sight of my poor friend's murder. To my great amazement, I saw my arms, although visible to my eye, were without substance, and the bodies of the men I struck at and my own came close together after each blow, through the shadowy arms I struck with. My blows were delivered with more extreme violence than I ever think I exerted, but I became painfully convinced of my incompetency. I have no consciousness of what happened after this feeling of unsubstantiality came upon me. Next morning, I experienced the stiffness and soreness of violent bodily exercise, and was informed by his wife that in the course of the night he had much alarmed her by striking out again and again in a terrific manner, as if fighting for his life. He, in turn, informed her of his dream, and begged her to remember the names of those actors in it who were known to him. On the morning of the following day, Wednesday, A. received a letter from his agent, who resided in the town close to the scene of the dream, informing him that his tenant had been found on Tuesday morning at Major N.M.'s gate, speechless and apparently dying from a fracture of the skull, and that there was no trace of the murderers. That night A. started for the town and arrived there on Thursday morning. On his way to a meeting of magistrates, he met the senior magistrate of that part of the country and requested him to give orders for the arrest of the 3 men whom, besides H.W., he had recognized in his dream, and to have them examined separately. This was at once done. The 3 men gave identical accounts of the occurrence, and all named the woman who was with them. She was then arrested and gave precisely similar testimony. They said that between 11 and 12 on the Monday night they had been walking homewards all together along the road, when they were overtaken by 3 strangers, 2 of whom savagely assaulted H.W., while the other prevented his friends from interfering. H.W. did not die, but was never the same man afterwards. He subsequently emigrated. Stead, the English editor and psychical researcher, relates the following case, which he accepts as truthful and correct, after careful investigation of the circumstances and of the character and reputation of the person relating it. The story proceeds as follows. St. Eglos is situated about 10 miles from the Atlantic, and not quite so far from the old market town of Trebedwina. Hart and George Northey were brothers, and from childhood their lives had been marked by the strongest brotherly affection. Hart and George Northey had never been separated from their birth until George became a sailor, Hart meantime joining his father in business. On the 8th of February, 1840, while George Northey's ship was lying in port at St. Helena, he had the following strange dream. Last night I dreamt that my brother was at Trebedwina Market, and that I was with him, quite close by his side, during the whole of the market transactions. Although I could see and hear which passed around me, I felt sure that it was not my bodily presence which thus accompanied him, but my shadow, or rather my spiritual presence, for he seemed quite unconscious that I was near him. I felt that my being thus present in this strange way betokened some hidden danger which he was destined to meet, and which I know my presence could not avert, for I could not speak to warn him of his peril. The story then proceeds to relate how Hart collected considerable money at Trebedwina Market, and then started to ride homeward. George tells what happened to his brother on the way, as follows. My terror gradually increased as Hart approached the hamlet of Pokero, until I was in a perfect frenzy, frantically desirous, yet unable to warn my brother in some way and prevent him from going further. I suddenly became aware of two dark shadows thrown across the road. I felt that my brother's hour had come, and I was powerless to aid him. Two men appeared, whom I instantly recognized as notorious poachers who lived in a lonely wood near St. Eglos. They wished him good night, mister, civilly enough, he replied, and entered into conversation with them about some work he had promised them. After a few minutes they asked him for some money. The elder of the two brothers, who was standing near the horse's head, said, Mr. Northey, we know you have just come from Trebedwina Market with plenty of money in your pockets. We are desperate men, and you ain't going to leave this place until we've got that money. So hand over. My brother made no reply except to slash at him with the whip and spur the horse at him. The younger of the ruffians instantly drew a pistol and fired. Hart dropped lifeless from the saddle, and one of the villains held him by the throat with a grip of iron for some minutes, as thought to make assurance doubly sure, and crush out any particle of life my poor brother might have left. The murderers secured the horse to a tree in the orchard, and, having rifled the corpse, they dragged it up the stream, concealing it under the overhanging banks of the watercourse. Then they carefully covered over all marks of blood on the road, and hid the pistol in the thatch of a disused hut close to the roadside. Then, setting the horse free to gallop home alone, they decamped across the country to their own cottage. The story then relates how George Northey's vessel left St. Helena the next day after the dream, and reached Plymouth in due time. George carried with him a very vivid recollection of his vision on the return voyage, and never doubted for an instant that his brother had been actually murdered in the manner and by the persons named, as seen in the vision. He carried with him the determination to bring the villains to justice, and was filled with the conviction that through his efforts retribution would fall upon the murderers. In England, justice was at work, but the missing link was needed. The crime aroused universal horror and indignation, and the authorities left nothing undone in the direction of discovering the murderers and bringing them to justice. Two brothers named Heightwood were suspected, and in their cottage were found blood-stained garments. But no pistol was found, although the younger brother admitted having owned but lost one. They were arrested and brought before the magistrates. The evidence against them was purely circumstantial, and not any too strong at that, but their actions were those of guilty men. They were committed for trial. Each confessed, in hopes of saving his life and obtaining imprisonment instead. But both were convicted and sentenced to be hanged. There was doubt in the minds of some, however, about the pistol. The story continues. Before the execution, George Northey arrived from St. Helena and declared that the pistol was in the thatch of the old cottage close by the place where they had murdered Hart Northey and where they had hid it. How do you know? He was asked. George replied, I saw the foul deed committed in a dream I had the night of the murder when at St. Helena. The pistol was found, as George Northey had predicted, in the thatch of the ruined cottage. Investigation revealed that the details of the crime were identical with those seen in the vision. It is a fact known to all occultists that many persons frequently travel in the astral body during sleep, and in many cases retain a faint recollection of some of the things they have seen and heard during their travels in the astral. Nearly everyone knows the experience of waking up in the morning feeling physically tired and used up. In some cases, a dim recollection of walking or working during the dream being had. Who among us has not had the experience of walking on the air, or in the air, without the feet touching the ground, being propelled simply by the effort of the will? And who of us has had not experienced that dreadful falling through space sensation in dreams, with the sudden awakening just before we actually struck Earth? And who has not had the mortifying dream experience of walking along the street, or in some public place, and being suddenly overcome by the consciousness that we were in our night clothes, or perhaps without any clothing at all. All of these things are more or less distorted recollection of astral journeyings. But while these dream excursions in the astral are harmless, the conscious going out in the astral is not so. There are many planes of the astral into which it is dangerous and unpleasant for the uninstructed person to travel, unless accompanied by a capable occultist as guide. Therefore, I caution all students against trying to force development in that direction. Nature surrounds you with safeguards and interposes obstacles for your own protection and good. Do not try to break through these obstacles without knowledge of what you are doing. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Remember, and a little learning is a dangerous thing. When you have reached the stage of development in which it will be safe for you to undertake conscious astral explorations, then will your guide be at hand, and the instruction furnished you by those capable of giving it to you. Do not try to break into the astral without due preparation and full knowledge, lest you find yourself in the state of the fish who leaped out of the water onto the banks of the stream. Your dream trips are safe. They will increase in variety and clearness, and you will remember more about them. All this before you may begin to try to consciously go out into the astral, as do the occultists. Be content to crawl before you may walk. Learn to add, multiply, subtract, and divide before you undertake the higher mathematics, algebra, geometry, etc. of occultism. End of lesson.